I wonder if you're looking forward this Christmas to spending time with those you love, with family, and maybe enjoying company and conversation. Well, a few months ago, I was able to go to Canada. Christine and I went together to spend time with my daughter. We did a lot of touring, a lot of traveling around parts of Canada that I hadn't seen before. And even though I keep in touch with my daughter regularly through messages and through video calls, there's nothing quite the same as seeing somebody in person, is there? To be able to hug and to hold someone, to share that non-verbal communication as well as talking to them, to watch how they interact with other people, and even do things together without speaking. But also being with someone, you see their habits, both the good and the bad. You can have disagreements about the best way to do things, negotiate what to eat and where to go. All these are things that you can do in person that are harder to do when you're apart. And then also, there's those times, do you know, when you press each other's buttons? When you kind of just know what gets on top of each other. I can see a few people nodding. This is all part of seeing somebody in person, of being in their presence. Also know that for some people, being with family is not going to be easy this Christmas. For some, it's also going to be hard knowing that you won't be with those you love, either because of distance or some family breakdown, or maybe because that person is no longer with us this Christmas. In our Advent series, we've been looking at the arrival of Jesus, and today we're going to be thinking about how he came in presence, how he came in person. You know, for the people living at the time of Jesus, knowing God's presence was not something that was new to them. They would remember, if you talked about God's presence, they would remember back to that time, I'm sure we've talked about it before, when God's presence was marked by a pillar of fire during the night and a pillar of cloud during the day. It was a real tangible sign that God was with them as they went through the wilderness to the land that God had promised them. And then as the people got to their land and moved into their land and enjoyed peace and security, they believed that that peace and security was because of God's presence with them. Do you remember a few weeks ago, Lucy was talking about the Ark of the Covenant? She had a picture on the screen as well. And that was a sign of God's presence. Wherever God's people went, the Ark went, because it symbolized God's presence going with them. And you remember David wanted to build a home for this ark because it was so special, but he had to wait until his son Solomon built that home where the ark could have a place central to the people. However, later on, the people disobeyed God and they no longer followed him. They were taken into exile, and they longed to be back to that place, the place where they felt the presence of God once again. Eventually, they did return to their own land, but it wasn't quite as it had been before. They still were looking forward to a time when the new king, the Messiah, would build a new people and a new kingdom. What's all that got to do with the Christmas story? Well, that's all the background to where we come to the story today. When Joseph, who was engaged to Mary, engagement in that time was a lot more than what we considered. It was really more like marriage, betrothed to Mary. When he found out that Mary was with child, he had a dilemma. Because in that culture, the real thing that he should have done he was entitled to do was to divorce Mary in a very public way often. But Joseph didn't want to do that. He wanted to try and deal with the situation in a way that respected Mary. And it's at this time when Joseph's trying to work out what to do that the angel appears to Joseph. And we have these words that the angel speaks. Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. And then we read this, that as this all took place to fulfill what was said by the prophet, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, God with us. Emmanuel means God with us. And that was a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus coming in his presence. God was fulfilling a promise that was made hundreds of years earlier to his people, that God would come in a new way. He would send his son to be Emmanuel, God with us. So this morning I want us to look at what that means. Let's unpack that phrase, Emmanuel, God with us. And what does that mean to us here today in the 21st century? If you have your little invitation cards, we've probably given them all out, so you probably don't have them on the seats anymore. The verse that we've used for our sermon series and for our invitation says this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And that's the first thing that the word Emmanuel, God with us, shows us. That God came in flesh and blood into this world. The theological word that we use for that is the incarnation, God coming in flesh and blood. And the real mystery of the incarnation is that Jesus was fully God, born of the Spirit of God, as we just read, but he was also fully man, born of Mary. What did that mean? Well, Jesus, as a human, as a man, he experienced life on this earth as an unborn child, a baby. He was a toddler. He was a boy, then a teenager, and then an adult. He was dependent on his heavenly Father for life. He experienced frailty and weakness. He lived in a body that had a finite time span that was aging, and he knew what it was like to be weak and help and powerless. You know, the humanity of Jesus is something I think I've understood it a little bit better by watching the film series The Chosen. I don't know if anybody, I've mentioned this before, if anybody's watched that. Now, The Chosen is only an interpretation of somebody's interpretation of what we know from the Gospels, but nevertheless, I've found it conveys aspects of Jesus' humanity that were very likely given what was here in the Gospels. And you see, understanding the humanity of Jesus can help us to see Jesus coming alongside us in our everyday lives, sharing our humanity. Jesus would have experienced human emotions, all of the physical parts that we go through in our daily lives. He would have developed human relationships with children, with men, and with women. The good bits and the not so good bits of relationships. He would know joy and excitement, but also sadness and pain. what does that mean for us? Well, it means if we choose to invite Jesus into our lives and have an ongoing relationship with him, we're inviting the Jesus who walked on the earth and lived a human life to be our companion as we walk on this earth and live a human life. I particularly like the Message translation of the verse on our card, which says this: "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." You see, Jesus came to dwell in the place that you live, that you work, that you socialize, to move into the neighborhood that you live in, to be among the people that you spend time with, wherever that is and whatever neighborhood that is. And at Jesus' birth, the neighborhood that Jesus moved into was not one of riches and power, but of poverty and humility. And the Bible speaks to us elsewhere about the bias of God towards the poor and marginalized in society. When the angel announced this amazing good news, it wasn't to royalty or people of status or standing, but to a group of outcast shepherds who happened to be in the neighborhood at the time. But at the same time as Jesus, being fully human, living in the neighborhood, Jesus was also fully God, equal to his Father in heaven, we're told in Philippians chapter 2. Now, I think there's a mystery about this. And mysteries in the Bible are good to grapple with, as long as we realize that we might never fully understand them. We might ponder and puzzle over them, but never quite understand them with human eyes. Jesus was fully human, and Jesus was fully God. Many of the carols that we sing over Christmas touch upon this. And I think it's a great time at Christmas just to enter into that wonder, that mystery of the fact that Jesus, fully God, came to us as fully man. But there's another way that Jesus came to be God with us. I think this is maybe the most important thing from this verse that we could learn this morning. Because Jesus came in his presence so that we would no longer be separated from God. So how does Jesus coming in presence do that? How does that bring us closer to God? You see, the problem was that sin separated humankind from God. It started back with Adam. You remember that sin came into the world when Adam sinned, and therefore everybody born after this was born into sin. And what was the immediate effect of Adam's sin? Well, it was separation from God. You remember Adam and Eve were immediately put out of the garden. They were away from the place where they used to enjoy fellowship, to enjoy and spend time in God's presence. They lost the full experience of God's presence when Adam sinned as they were put out the garden. And you know, that has an interesting link into Joseph's role in the Christmas story. Because in the passage that we read in Matthew, Joseph's angel, we hear this about Joseph's angel. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home to be his wife. Joseph was a practical guy. He was a carpenter by trade. On the screen, you probably see a picture there, and that's for those of you who managed to go to it, it's from the Angels Among Us exhibition that was recently held down at Maharalin. And this is the interpretation of Joseph's angel with all the shavings and the carpenter's bits and pieces round about. To me, that just emphasized and spoke to me about Joseph, practical guy trying to deal with this situation, the angel coming and speaking to him. I don't know about you, but when I wake up from a dream, it takes me a while to get fully awake. It takes me a while to decide what I'm going to do in the day normally once I wake up. But Joseph, he woke up and it says he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him. I'm sure Joseph did have questions and concerns, but he did what the angel had told him. And that was very significant as we look at this story of Christmas and Jesus coming in presence. You see, it's through Joseph that the prophecies are fulfilled that Jesus will be the son of David. Because it's Joseph's heritage, which we read about in the long list of names in Matthew chapter 1. And it was because Joseph obeyed the angel and took Mary to be his wife, not rejecting her or divorcing her. It's because of that Jesus became the legal ancestor of David. If he hadn't accepted her, Jesus would not be part of that inheritance. But Joseph obeyed what the angel said, and Jesus became the legal son of Joseph, the legal son of Abraham, and the descendancy going all the way back to Adam. Through the virgin birth, Jesus was not born of human descent, he was born of God. He was born without sin, and he lived a life without sin so that he could die for all of us. But by becoming fully human, born of Mary, and then through Mary's marriage to Joseph, he took on became a legal descendant of Adam. Jesus then became the true representative of all of us. He became the one and only person who could bridge that gap that separated us from God. I know this is probably something we think about more at Easter when we celebrate Christ's death and resurrection, but it all starts here in the Christmas story. It starts when Jesus was born in the flesh, the child of Mary, and the heir of Joseph. You know, the big theological word we use for God bringing us back to himself and no longer being separate is reconciliation. You know, reconciliation, I think, is an interesting word, isn't it, at this Christmas time, as we prepare for Christmas celebrations. You see, for some of us, there's going to be a joy of coming together as families, seeing each other in person. But for others, there's probably going to be a lot of tension, isn't there? Even families that get on well, there's probably going to be tension. And for others, there's going to be the prospect of not seeing other members of our family where relationships have broken down. God's work of reconciliation, of bringing us back to his presence, begins by accepting what Jesus did through being born in the flesh and dying in the flesh. But you know, God's reconciliation doesn't stop there. He's also working to reconcile, to bring together our relationships with each other. And maybe you're in that position where relationships are broken down within your family with somebody else. And if that's you and you would like to receive prayer, we'd only be too happy after the service just to pray God's presence into your family and into your situation at this time. And there's a final way that I want us to look at God with us this morning. And it comes right at the end of Matthew's Gospel, because Jesus came to be God with us as a lasting promise. You see, at the end of Jesus' ministry, before he ascends into heaven, Jesus sends his disciples out into all the earth. And the message that he sent the disciples with was very similar to the one that the angel came to Joseph, that Jesus will save his people from their sins. But he also told his disciples to take that message and go and make disciples as they share the good news. As we go out to share the message of good news that God has brought us back to himself, has broken that separation, Jesus gives us this promise: I am with you always to the end of the age. The theologian R.T. France says the two verses in Matthew's Gospel, the one at the beginning, Emmanuel, God with us, and the one at the end, I am with you always. Both of those form like a bookmark at either end that frame the whole of the gospel. God promises to be Emmanuel with us in all of our lives.